So at an event recently, I was asked a question. And the question that I was asked is a really good question. It's also a difficult question to answer. But the question I was asked was, do I think that there will ever be a vegan world? And if so, do I think that it will happen in my lifetime? Now, I get asked this question quite often for understandable reasons. But the reason I said before that it's a difficult question to answer is I think primarily for two reasons. Now, the first and most obvious is that we don't know what's going to happen. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen. But even though the future is unknown, I do still think that we can make informed assumptions and educated guesses. We can look at current trends, the current direction of things, sort of technologies. We can look to our history and our past to see how things change and what change looks like. So I do think that we can make informed guesses, even though obviously we can't say that something definitely will or won't happen. But I think the other reason why this is a difficult question to answer is because it's so mood dependent. I mean, we know as vegans, don't we, that some days you wake up and you have a great day. You hang out with some vegan friends maybe, or you have a great conversation with a family member or friend or work colleague, or maybe you read some positive vegan news online, or maybe you just have a generally nice day and you feel optimistic about the world in general. And during those days, it feels like anything's possible. Our vegan future, it's an inevitability. Of course, we're going to get there. The world is changing. Everything's very positive. It looks great. We've got this. And then on other days, it's the opposite, isn't it? We wake up, maybe we have an argument, a disagreement, the conversation doesn't go well. Or maybe it's things outside of the vegan bubble that just get us down, like elections, maybe, or current geopolitical events, or just things that are generally happening. Because, let's be honest, the world right now, it doesn't feel so good, does it? It doesn't feel like we're going in the direction that we need to be going in. And I think that poses a relatively tricky question to us as vegans. Because obviously as vegans, what we want is progression, change, positive change. We want to challenge dominant mindsets and challenge the current paradigm that exists, this transgressive, speciesist and archaic paradigm which condones the mass exploitation of trillions of non-human animals. Fundamentally, we're challenging something that is so deeply ingrained and is perpetuated by industries that are huge, are gargantuan in size, heavily politically resourced, financially resourced. And so we are up against something that is so ingrained and so powerful. And as a consequence, what we need is an appetite, pardon the pun, in society for progressive social change. I don't feel like it's a spoiler to say that it doesn't feel like that's what we have right now. It doesn't feel like we're moving forward. It feels like, if anything, we are going backwards. I think at best we could maybe say that we're treading water, but really it feels like we're taking steps backwards. But I think what's really important, therefore, to grasp is what may seem like a paradox, but is obviously true, which is that two things can be true at the same time. Something that is negative can be happening, something that is disappointing can be happening, negative conversations with family members and friends can occur, negative vegan news can be released, a feeling of pessimism can arise, but also that doesn't mean that there isn't positive things happening at the same time. It doesn't mean that change isn't happening. It doesn't mean that productive conversations are not taking place. It doesn't mean that social change isn't occurring just because there is also negativity in the world. There is bad and good happening simultaneously. And so it may seem paradoxical, but it depends how we shift our perspective and our focus. And understandably, we're going to lean often more to the negative side, and we shouldn't ignore that. But for us to remain positive and optimistic, I think we also have to lean into the other side as well. Balance is key. And I actually think one of the most important things that we can do when we speak of change is to look to the past. Because let's be frank for a second, the world has never been a utopia, has it? There's always been problems. There's always been injustice. There's always been exploitation, harm, violence, immorality. These things have existed throughout human history, and yet change has also occurred throughout human history. And what this shows us is that change happens despite the immorality, despite the transgressions, despite the archaic paradigms and mindsets that dominate the times in which change is occurring. So actually looking to our past gives us a renewed sense of confidence and optimism for what can be and for what we can all create together. So let's go back to 2015, because 2015 was a huge year for me, as it was the year that I went vegan. And I remember back in 2015, I used to go to my local organic store because, hey, it was 2015, what was a vegan to do, right? And I remember in my local organic store, they had this bar of vegan chocolate, and it was from this company called Vego. And so I picked up this bar of vegan chocolate, I took it home, and it was absolutely delicious. I mean, it was just good chocolate. So imagine how happy it has made me that Vego and I have actually been chatting recently, and they have very kindly partnered with me on today's video, which means that I now get to tell you all about their amazing range of vegan chocolate. Now, Vego is an entirely vegan chocolate company. They have the Vego bar, which is the one I just referenced, and to me is kind of like the holy grail of vegan chocolate bars, but they also have grown their range since those early days, and they have an incredible range now which includes white chocolate, dark chocolate, they've got a crisp, they have got melts, which are great for hot chocolate and baking, they have vegan praline, honestly just so good, melts in the mouth, and they also have a vegan hazelnut chocolate spread. And as well as all of their products being vegan, they also use organic ingredients, and their chocolate is fair trade, which means that their products are ethical from the perspective of what we do to non-human animals and also humans as well. You can also order directly from Vego through their online stores, and this includes in the US because they just recently launched their US online store. And it gets even better because if you use the code 24ed, you can actually get 20% off of their products when you order them through their online stores. Plus, the 24ed code is also suitable for items they already have on sale on their online stores, meaning that you might even be able to get a bigger discount. So let's get back to the conversation that we were just having, but a huge thank you to Vego for partnering with me on today's video, and I hope that you guys enjoy their products for yourselves too. But looking back to 2015 isn't just a nice thing for me to do personally because of my memories of that time. It's also an important thing to do because if we think about the vegan world back then, it was far less developed than it is now. And that's the thing about looking backwards, right? We go back to 2014, 2015, but then let's go back to 2004, 2005. Let's go back to the 90s, the 80s, the 70s. When we look backwards, it can reinforce to us how much change has actually occurred in what is, of course, a relatively short period of time. And if we think about the past 10 years, of course, things are not necessarily where we would like them to be, but they're far better than they were 10 years ago. And I suppose there's an interesting thing, which is right now it feels like there is a lot of pushback against veganism, that there's a lot of negative conversation, a lot of negative media reporting, a lot of financial difficulties for certain plant-based companies. And it may feel like right now there is more pushing back against us than there was 10 years ago. And that's because realistically there is, but there's only pushback because of the change that's occurred and because of the progress that we've made. There's not going to be pushback against something that really only exists in the fringes of society that isn't mainstream. The reason it feels like there's so much pushback against veganism is because of what's happened within, well, the past 7-8 years, but of course before then as well. And so looking to our past can actually help us feel positive about what can be achieved in a relatively short space of time. And another reason why looking backwards is good is because it can give us a sense of perspective about the difficulties that we face. I think of the activists, the pioneers, the academics, the educators, the philosophers. I think of the vegan food pioneers who were championing food change and system change in a time where doing so was far less socially palatable than it is even now. I mean, actually, the conversation around the need to change how we eat is incredibly mainstream now. I mean, of course, from the vegan perspective, it may not encapsulate everything that we want it to encapsulate, and it may not be because of the ethical reasons that we believe it should be for, but the fact that there is this conversation about an environmental need or a health need or a social need for changing how we consume food is still notable and something we should feel positive about, because 10, 15 years ago, that conversation really didn't exist, especially not like it does now. So then the question becomes, is there going to be enough progress? Will we ever have a vegan world? And I think to answer that question, we, of course, straight away have to acknowledge what a vegan world would actually look like. And obviously a vegan world isn't just one where there's a plant-based food system, because veganism transcends beyond just diet. Obviously, of course, we can have a plant-based food system, but still be in a non-vegan world. Although a vegan world will obviously be one that has a plant-based food system. The reason I stress this is because to create a truly vegan world would therefore mean creating a world where the exploitation of animals in all of its different and varied forms no longer exists. So do I think that we will ever have a truly vegan world? I think it would be really difficult to answer that question with a strong, convincing yes. And I think the reason for that is because in order to do so would mean that I believe that we're going to reach something akin to a utopia, where we've addressed all exploitation, all suffering, all immorality, all of these things. And I think that's just going to be very, very unlikely. So I don't think we'll ever have a vegan world in terms of the way that we would all absolutely ideally like it to be. I think that's probably unrealistic. But that doesn't mean that we can't make huge strides. And I mean huge strides in terms of getting close to that. And the reason I say close to that is because if we think about the majority of the exploitation that occurs, food, testing, clothing, entertainment, I think that these are all things that we can overcome. And I think technology will play a big part. I mean, let's get it out there straight away. What about something like cell-cultured meat? Now, undeniably, there is a huge pushback against cell-cultured meat. It's been banned in Italy, in states like Florida, in the US, and so there is pushback against it. But at the same time, even though there's pushback against it, it seems like it's a technology that at some point is going to break through. At least we hope it does. And if it does, then that would essentially render animal farming obsolete. It would be cheaper, healthier, safer, no antibiotics, no risk of pandemics from bird flu and swine flu, far more sustainable, and obviously removes the animals from the creation of these foods. And so as a consequence of that, as long as we can get people to recognize the merits of it, if it becomes commercially viable, there's no reason why it shouldn't then render animal farming obsolete. And obviously we would therefore hope unethical in people's minds, but obsolete to the point where animal farming would no longer exist, at least not in the way that it currently does. So if we take that and we run with the assumption that that's something that is most likely going to happen, that means that we will address probably the vast majority of animal farming. Now, I say the vast majority because there'll be some people who won't want to eat cell-cultured meat, and there'll be some people who think that sort of regenerative, extensive farming is this wonderful, holistic, idealistic thing, and there'll be some people who probably will still push for maybe the farming of certain species in certain environments. However, let's run with a slightly different thought that could maybe relate to the adoption of cell-cultured meat. Let's say that the vast majority of people are now eating cell-cultured meat. They're no longer partaking in the slaughtering of animals. Does the mentality of people then change when they've removed their participation from the actual violence that they currently sadly fund? I think there is something to be said for distance allowing us to view something more objectively. And if we're no longer paying for these things to happen, and as a consequence people are starting to view the farming of animals as obsolete, does that distance from the farming of animals allow people to view it more objectively and as a consequence begin to see it as the unethical thing that it is? Does that mean that at a certain point we might actually start to challenge the fundamental ethics of farming animals in any form because the vast majority of people are no longer paying for these things and as a consequence are thinking more rationally and objectively? I also think technology will render animal testing obsolete and people will then phase out of it and move past that. I think that's something that will inevitably happen as well. I think most people in society already recognize that animal testing is barbaric. They may justify it through this feeling of it being a necessity or that it represents a greater good kind of scenario. That's how people may currently justify it. But I think one thing about animal testing is that we're all in agreement, hopefully vegan or non-vegan, that a world without animal testing is far more ethical and preferable than a world with animal testing. And hopefully we'll get to that point with food and clothing and entertainment and such, where people will also recognize that a world without this exploitation of animals is far more preferable and ethical than a world with all of this exploitation of animals. And things like, I suppose, aquariums and zoos and such, well, hopefully maybe technology will render them obsolete because people will have far greater experiences with animals through, let's say, a VR setting than they would staring at them in a cage or swimming around in what is essentially a bathtub. Now, it's a little bit disheartening to view all of this change through the lens of technology making it more affordable and technology making our experiences with animals better or rendering the farming of animals obsolete. It's kind of saying, well, we'll get rid of the exploitation of animals when there's something better for us humans in the picture. That's kind of a really disheartening way of viewing it, isn't it? But I do think that there probably is some truth to that. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be huge amounts of change because of an ethical awareness and a changing of mindsets. We absolutely need that as well. I mean, that's vital if we're to progress as a species, especially if we are to progress to a point where we are as close to a vegan world as possible. So it is essential, and don't get me wrong, that's going to be a huge part of this as well. The awareness, the inclination to change for important fundamental reasons like the ethics of what we do to animals, like challenging ourselves from a moral perspective. That will play a big part of it as well, which is why it's so vital that we as vegans are communicating this message and bringing people in and championing the ethics and the philosophy that underpins veganism, because that is a core essential part of creating social progress and change as well, because we need people to challenge their mindsets, to challenge the ingrained paradigm of animal exploitation that is condoned by the masses. We need this as well. But I think technology will play a huge role, and I strongly believe that even though there is a pushback, I think it will come to be that these things are introduced. So that then leads to the question of, will I see this in my lifetime? Now, we've already kind of established, or at least I have, that I don't think a truly vegan world will happen, so I'm not going to see one in my lifetime. But do I think that I will see a world that is very different to the one that I'm currently living in? Yes, because again, if I'm placing some emphasis, or at least a significant amount of emphasis, on the adoption of technology, let's say that I live to sort of an average age. That means I've got more than 50 years of life remaining, hopefully, right? Fingers crossed the vegan diet will help with that, I'm hoping, right? So let's say that I've got more than 50 years of life left. If this technology hasn't been adopted in that time, it's highly likely that it means that it's failed. So if I'm confident that this technology will succeed, or at least succeed substantially, then that means I should really be confident that I will see a lot of change in my lifetime. And so therefore I am. What that means, I suppose, is that I'm feeling fairly optimistic in many ways. Obviously, somewhat cautious, somewhat apprehensive to say that things will be and things are going to be, and all of these different ways of potentially framing what could come to pass. But I'm still optimistic about the change that will happen anyway. I mean, a lot of that change will happen because it is a necessity from a food security perspective, a sustainability perspective, a global health perspective related to antibiotic resistance and pandemics and such. So a lot of it will happen because it's a necessity. A lot of it will happen because of technology. A lot of it will happen because of an ethical growing awareness. And so I suppose there is a lot of reason to be positive. But then there's always this little thing in the back of my head, I don't know, maybe you can relate to this, where I start to feel a little bit like, yeah, hang on a minute, there is all of these things that are going to happen, and then in the back of my head, there's just this little nagging voice almost, and it goes, no, that's too optimistic. There's no way that can happen. Think of everything that's going on. Think of what we have to overcome. How can you say that in the next 55 or so years, this huge change will occur, and, dismantling of these industries is going to take place, and there's going to be so much progress in all of these different ways. And I think back to just a few days ago, I was walking down the street and I came across this van, and the van had parked outside a butcher's. It was on the other side of the road to the butcher's. And the butchers were in the back of this van. And there was a shopping trolley just at the doors, the doors that open up into the back of the van. And in that shopping trolley, there was 3 lambs who'd been skinned, their organs had been pulled out, they'd been beheaded, their hoofs had been cut off. And then in the van was about 20 or so more lambs hung up in a row in this refrigerated van. And they were unloading these beheaded, skinned lambs into a shopping trolley and then carting them over the road to take them into the butcher shop to then slice them and sell them. And when I start to talk about a vegan world and progress and change and optimism, things like that creep in the back. They just come in, and I just think, what are you saying? What are you saying, Ed? It's easy for you to sit here safe and sound and talk about, oh, it's great, all these things are happening. But tell that to the pig in the gas chamber, tell that to the lamb in the farm, tell that to the animal hanging in the slaughterhouse, the animal cowering in fear. And that's the thing, isn't it, about this message, the vegan message? Change will never happen quickly enough. And so in a way, we start to feel guilty because we're talking about change, in the next 50, 60 years. But at any day longer that this immorality persists is a day too long. How can change occur quickly enough to satisfy the urgency of the change that needs to occur? And I start to feel so guilty talking about it like this, because there's trillions of animals who will be killed this year, 1 to 2 trillion maybe, 1 to 2 next year. This continues. Every day this violence continues. And any change will never feel fast enough precisely because of what it is that we're trying to overcome. How can change happen quickly enough to address the severity of what is happening every single day? And so I feel guilty in a sense to talk about this change, because undeniably I would rather it happen in 50, 55 years than never happen. But why would it take so long for something so obvious to be understood? Why would it take so long for us to realize that gas chambers are evil contraptions of violence? How can it possibly take us so long to understand that forcibly impregnating animals and taking babies from mothers, these are not actions of a species that can claim to be compassionate or ethical. These are the actions of a species that allows itself to be dominated by a false sense of authority and power and entitlement. And so I feel guilty to talk about that. I walked past that shopping trolley with the lambs beheaded. It's not just the visual of that, there's the smell. I don't know if you can relate to this, but the smell of the flesh, it really haunts me. I just find the smell so unnerving, so disconcerting, just so awful, the smell. And there I am on this street, this populated street, and it is a bright day, sunshine, and there are people walking past, and there are these animals who have been through so much harm and exploitation in a shopping trolley, about to be cast into a butcher shop to be cut up so that people can go in and buy their flesh. And it's in those moments thinking about that it feels like this conversation of change is a luxury that we have to talk about change. But undeniably, this is the hard thing about veganism, and it relates to what I was saying earlier about balance. The balance. It is those moments that drives me to keep advocating and speaking up. Of course it is. It is those moments. It is that imagery in my mind. It is that violence, that visceral violence that exists, and in that moment existed in front of me, that drives me to do what I do, because of course it does. That is what drives us to be vegan, to do what we do every single day, even when it's hard, even when it's an inconvenience. That's why we do it. So it's that balance. That's why we do what we do, and yet ultimately we must remain positive. And so again, it's that duality of understanding the harm that exists, not overlooking the harm that exists. It's not about ignoring it. It's about acknowledging it, but still feeling positive about what is happening and what will hopefully come to be. And so, do I think I'll see a vegan world in my lifetime? No. But I do believe, even if somewhat with a sense of caution and trepidation, that if I am to reach that old age and become an old man in the twilight years of my life, if I am to reach that point, and of course I hope that I do, if I am to reach those twilight years as an old man, I am confident that I will look back on my entire life and I will compare how things are then to how things are right now, and I will say, it may not be the world that I would like it to be. It might not have happened in the ways that I necessarily predicted that it would. And of course, there is still work that will need to be done after I pass on. But at least it will be a different place to the one that it is right now in 2024. Anyway, that brings me to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. What I would really love now is for you to let me know down below in the comments what you think. Do you share my positivity? Do you share my optimism? Do you maybe share some of the worries and concerns that I have? I would love to know. And maybe you don't share my optimism at all. Well, I may have a resource just for you, because if you sign up to my mailing list, I will send you regular good news roundups. Now, a good news roundup is basically an email which contains all of the positive vegan news and animal rights related news that's been taking place. So it's a great way to feel more positive and optimistic. And maybe you already are a positive person. Well, this good news roundup will only aid you in feeling even more positive. So if you're interested, there will be a link in the description. There'll also be links to the Vego online stores in the description as well. But a huge thank you to all of you for watching this video. A huge thank you to Vego for partnering with me. And I look forward to seeing all of you in the next video.